The kitchen was a whirlwind of chaos, as it always was during the dinner rush. The sizzle of pans, the clatter of plates, and the shouts of orders filled the air. At the center of it all stood the head chef, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a face lined with years of hard work. He moved with precision, his hands steady as he plated dish after dish, each one a masterpiece. The staff around him worked in harmony, following his lead without question. He was the heart of the kitchen, the glue that held everything together. But that night, everything changed. The restaurant owner, a man in his early 40s with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, walked into the kitchen. His presence was unusual, he rarely stepped foot in the kitchen during service. The staff exchanged nervous glances as he made his way to the head chef. The chef looked up from the dish he was plating, his brow furrowed in confusion. "We need to talk," the owner said, his voice cold and clipped. The chef wiped his hands on his apron and followed the owner into the small office at the back of the kitchen. The door closed behind them, and the kitchen fell silent for the first time that night. The staff exchanged worried whispers, but no one dared to say what they were all thinking. Inside the office, the owner didn't mince words. "I'm letting you go," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. The chef stared at him, stunned. "What? Why?" The owner shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "It's just not working out anymore. We need to go in a different direction." The chef's mind raced. He had been with the restaurant for over 20 years, pouring his heart and soul into every dish. He had trained most of the staff, created the menu, and built the restaurant's reputation from the ground up. And now, with no warning, no explanation, he was being cast aside. "This is a mistake," the chef said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't just throw me out like this." But the owner's mind was made up. "Clean out your locker and leave your keys on the desk," he said, turning away as if the conversation was already over. The chef stood there for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without a word, he walked out of the office and back into the kitchen. The staff watched in silence as he untied his apron and threw it on the counter. He grabbed his knife roll and walked out the door, his head held high but his heart heavy. The kitchen remained silent for a long time after he left. No one knew what to say. The head chef, the man who had been the backbone of the restaurant for decades, was gone, just like that. As the chef walked down the dimly lit street, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. He had no job, no plan, and no idea what to do next. But deep down, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of an incredible journey, one that would take him from the depths of despair to heights he had never imagined. But for now, all he could do was keep walking, one step at a time, into the unknown. The days that followed were a blur. The chef spent most of his time at home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The walls of his small apartment seemed to close in on him, and the silence was deafening. He had always been a man of action, someone who thrived in the chaos of a busy kitchen. But now, without a job or a purpose, he felt lost. His family tried to help. His wife, a kind and patient woman, did her best to lift his spirits. "You'll find something else," she said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're too talented to stay down for long." But the chef wasn't so sure. He had spent his entire career at one restaurant, building his reputation from the ground up. Starting over at his age felt impossible. He was in his late 50s, and the culinary world was changing. Younger chefs with flashy techniques and social media followings were taking over, and he felt like a relic of a bygone era. Still, he knew he had to try. He updated his resume and started applying for jobs, but the rejections came quickly and without explanation. "We're looking for someone with a more modern approach," one restaurant owner told him over the phone. "We need someone who can bring in a younger crowd," said another. The chef's confidence began to crumble. He had always prided himself on his skills and experience, but now it felt like none of that mattered. He started to question everything: his abilities, his choices, even his worth. The once proud chef who had commanded a kitchen with authority now felt like a shadow of his former self. Meanwhile, the restaurant he had left behind was struggling. Without his steady hand, the kitchen was in disarray. The new head chef, a young and ambitious man, tried to modernize the menu, but the regular customers were unhappy. The dishes lacked the soul and depth that the old chef had brought to the table, and the restaurant's reputation began to suffer. The chef heard about the restaurant's decline through the grapevine, and it only added to his frustration. He had poured his heart into that place, and now it was falling apart without him. But there was nothing he could do. He was just a man without a kitchen, watching from the sidelines as everything he had built crumbled. As the weeks turned into months, the chef's savings began to dwindle. He had always been careful with money, but the bills were piling up, and he had no income. The stress started to take a toll on his health, and he found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how things had gone so wrong. One day, while wandering through a local farmer's market, the chef ran into an old friend. The man, who ran a small food truck, greeted him with a warm smile. "I heard what happened," he said. "I'm really sorry, man. That's rough." The chef shrugged, trying to hide his embarrassment. "It is what it is," he said. The friend hesitated for a moment, then said, "Look, I could use some help with the food truck. It's not much, but it's something." "What do you say?" The chef was taken aback. A food truck? It was a far cry from the fine dining he was used to, but it was work. And right now, he couldn't afford to be picky. "I'll think about it," he said, though deep down, he knew he didn't have many options. That night, as he lay in bed, the chef thought about the offer. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a chance to get back in the kitchen, to do what he loved. Maybe it was time to swallow his pride and take a step back to move forward. The next morning, he called his friend and accepted the offer. It wasn't the comeback he had envisioned, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you need. The food truck was small, cramped, and nothing like the spacious, well-equipped kitchen the chef was used to. But as he stepped inside for the first time, he felt a familiar spark, a flicker of excitement that he hadn't felt in months. The smell of sizzling onions and the sound of a grill hissing brought back memories of his early days in the culinary world, when he was just starting out and every dish felt like an adventure. His friend, the owner of the food truck, handed him an apron and a spatula. "Welcome aboard," he said with a grin. "Let's see what you've got." The chef rolled up his sleeves and got to work. At first, it was strange cooking in such a small space, but he quickly adapted. He started with simple dishes, grilled sandwiches, tacos, and burgers, but even these humble meals had his signature touch. He added fresh herbs, homemade sauces, and unexpected flavor combinations that made each bite unforgettable. Word spread quickly. Customers who had been regulars at the food truck started noticing a difference. The food tasted richer, more vibrant, and somehow more satisfying. Lines began to form, and the truck's social media pages buzzed with praise. "This is the best food truck meal I've ever had," one customer posted. "Who's the new chef?" "He's a genius," wrote another. The chef's friend was thrilled. "You're a game changer," he said, clapping the chef on the back. "People can't get enough of your food." For the first time in months, the chef felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just cooking to survive, he was cooking to create, to bring joy to people through his food. It wasn't the fine dining he was used to, but it was honest, heartfelt work, and that meant something. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, as he cleaned the food truck and prepped for the next day, he would think about his old restaurant. He wondered if anyone there missed him, if they even remembered the years of dedication he had poured into that place. He missed the prestige, the respect, the feeling of being at the top of his game. But then he would look around the food truck, at the small but loyal team he was now a part of, and he would remind himself that this was where he was meant to be, for now, at least. He was rebuilding, one dish at a time. One day, as the food truck was packing up after a busy lunch service, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. It was a former colleague from the old restaurant, a young line cook who had always looked up to the chef. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Finally, the young cook broke the silence. "I heard you were here," he said, his voice tinged with both admiration and sadness. "I just wanted to say, I miss working with you. The kitchen isn't the same without you." The chef felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a lot." The young cook hesitated, then added, "Things are not great at the restaurant. The new head chef, he's not you. The customers are complaining, and the staff is miserable. I just thought you should know." The chef nodded, his mind racing. He had heard rumors about the restaurant's decline, but hearing it from someone who was still there made it feel more real. Part of him wanted to go back, to fix what had been broken. But another part of him knew that he had moved on, at least for now. As the young cook walked away, the chef stood there for a moment, lost in thought. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had found a new rhythm, a new way to share his passion for food. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The chef's success with the food truck didn't go unnoticed. As the lines grew longer and the buzz louder, it was only a matter of time before his old restaurant caught wind of his comeback. The owner, desperate to revive the struggling establishment, decided to make a bold move. He hired a new head chef, a young, ambitious culinary prodigy with a reputation for pushing boundaries and a flair for the dramatic. The new chef was in his early 30s, with a trendy haircut, a sleeve of tattoos, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had trained at some of the best restaurants in the world and had a loyal following on social media. When he walked into the kitchen on his first day, he made it clear that things were going to change. "This place needs a fresh start," he declared, standing in the middle of the kitchen with his arms crossed. "No more old-school, boring dishes. We're going to modernize the menu and bring in a younger crowd. If anyone can't keep up, they're out." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard rumors about the new chef's abrasive personality, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The young line cook who had visited the food truck felt a pang of guilt. He had always admired the old chef's dedication and humility, and this new guy was the complete opposite. Meanwhile, the chef at the food truck continued to thrive. His dishes, though simple, were crafted with care and precision, and people couldn't get enough. One day, as he was prepping for the lunch rush, a customer approached the window with a curious expression. "Hey, aren't you the guy who used to work at that fancy restaurant downtown?" the customer asked. The chef hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that was me." The customer grinned. "I thought so. I used to go there all the time. Your food was amazing. But lately, well, let's just say it's not the same. I'm glad I found you here." The chef thanked the customer, but the comment stuck with him. He had tried not to think about his old restaurant, but now it was impossible to ignore. He couldn't help but wonder what was happening there, what had become of the place he had dedicated so much of his life to. A few days later, he got his answer. The young line cook visited the food truck again, this time looking more stressed than ever. "You wouldn't believe what's happening at the restaurant," he said, his voice low. "The new chef is tearing everything apart. He's changing the menu, firing people, and treating the staff like garbage. The customers hate it, but he doesn't care. He's too busy posting pictures of his food on Instagram." The chef listened quietly, his heart heavy. He had poured his heart and soul into that restaurant, and now it was being destroyed by someone who cared more about fame than food. Part of him wanted to step in, to do something to stop the madness. But what could he do? He was just a guy in a food truck now. The rivalry between the two kitchens began to heat up. The new chef at the restaurant started making snide comments about the food truck in interviews, calling it amateurish and outdated. The chef at the food truck tried to ignore the insults, but they stung. He had always believed that food was about more than just trends. It was about heart, about tradition, about bringing people together. One evening, as the food truck was closing up for the night, the chef's friend handed him a newspaper. "You need to see this," he said, his expression grim. The chef unfolded the paper and saw a headline that made his blood boil. "Local food truck fails to impress. Is traditional cooking a thing of the past?" The article was filled with quotes from the new chef, mocking the food truck's old-fashioned approach and claiming that the future of food was in molecular gastronomy and avant-garde techniques. The chef clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He had always avoided drama, but this was too much. He wasn't going to stand by and let someone disrespect everything he had worked for. "What are you going to do?" his friend asked. The chef took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't know yet, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The chef couldn't shake the anger he felt after reading the article. It wasn't just the insults, it was the arrogance, the disrespect for everything he had built. He had always believed that food was about more than just trends or social media fame. It was about passion, tradition, and the joy of bringing people together. And now, someone was mocking that, someone who didn't understand the heart of what cooking truly meant. But as much as he wanted to fight back, he knew he had to be smart. He couldn't afford to make a scene or risk his reputation further. Instead, he focused on what he did best: cooking. The food truck continued to thrive, and the lines of loyal customers grew longer every day. People weren't just coming for the food, they were coming for the experience, for the warmth and authenticity that the chef brought to every dish. One afternoon, as the chef was prepping for the evening rush, an unexpected visitor arrived at the food truck. It was the restaurant owner, the man who had fired him all those months ago. The chef froze, his knife hovering over a pile of fresh herbs. The two men stared at each other in silence, the tension thick in the air. Finally, the owner spoke. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than the chef had ever heard it. The chef hesitated, then nodded. He stepped out of the food truck and followed the owner to a nearby park bench. They sat down, the distance between them feeling like miles. "I know I don't deserve your time," the owner began, his eyes fixed on the ground. "But I need to explain something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." The chef crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "Go on." The owner took a deep breath. "The truth is, I didn't want to fire you. You are, the best chef I've ever worked with. But I was pressured into it. There was an investor, someone with deep pockets and big plans for the restaurant. They wanted to bring in a younger chef, someone who could modernize the place and attract a different crowd. They threatened to pull their funding if I didn't make the change." The chef stared at him, stunned. All this time, he had thought it was his fault, that he had done something wrong. But now, hearing the truth, he felt a mix of emotions: anger, relief, and a deep sense of betrayal. "Why are you telling me this now?" the chef asked, his voice tight. The owner looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "Because I made a mistake. A huge one. The new chef, he's destroying everything we built. The customers hate the changes, the staff is miserable, and the restaurant is losing money. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. And I'm sorry." The chef sat in silence, processing everything he had just heard. Part of him wanted to yell, to demand answers, to make the owner feel the pain he had felt. But another part of him felt a strange sense of closure. He finally knew the truth, and that was something. "What do you want from me?" the chef asked finally. The owner hesitated, then said, "I want you to come back. I know I don't deserve to ask, but the restaurant needs you." "I need you." The chef shook his head. "I can't go back. Not after everything that's happened. But I'll think about what I can do." The owner nodded, looking defeated. "I understand. Thank you for hearing me out." As the owner walked away, the chef sat on the bench for a long time, lost in thought. He had spent months feeling like a failure, like he had been cast aside for no reason. But now, he realized that it wasn't about him, it was about greed, about people who cared more about money than passion. And that realization gave him a strange sense of strength. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone define his worth ever again. He had built something special with the food truck, something real and meaningful. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. There was still a fire burning inside him, a desire to prove that he was more than just a chef who had been cast aside. And he wasn't going to stop until he had his say. The chef sat in his small apartment that evening, a notebook open in front of him. The conversation with the restaurant owner had stirred something inside him, a determination he hadn't felt in months. He wasn't going to let the past define him. He wasn't going to let anyone take away what he had worked so hard to build. It was time to take control of his future. He started jotting down ideas, his pen moving furiously across the page. He didn't just want to keep running the food truck, he wanted to create something bigger, something that would prove once and for all that his way of cooking, rooted in tradition, passion, and heart, was still relevant. He wanted to open his own restaurant. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. He didn't have the money or the connections to start something from scratch. He would need investors, a location, and a team he could trust. It felt like an impossible dream, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to fight for it. The next morning, he called his friend from the food truck and shared his plan. "I want to open my own place," he said, his voice steady. "But I can't do it alone. I need your help." His friend didn't hesitate. "I'm in," he said. "Whatever you need, I've got your back." Together, they started laying the groundwork. They reached out to local suppliers, scouted potential locations, and began drafting a business plan. The chef poured his heart into every detail, from the menu to the decor. He wanted the restaurant to feel like an extension of himself, a place where people could come together and experience the joy of good food. But the biggest challenge was finding investors. The chef had never been good at selling himself, and the rejections came quickly. "You're too old to start something new," one potential investor told him bluntly. "The industry is changing, and you're not keeping up." The chef refused to let the criticism get to him. He knew his worth, and he wasn't going to let anyone tell him otherwise. He kept pushing, kept pitching, and slowly but surely, he started to gain traction. A local business owner who had been a regular at the food truck offered to invest, and soon others followed. It wasn't enough to fund the entire project, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the old restaurant continued to struggle. The new chef's flashy dishes and social media stunts had initially attracted attention, but the novelty had worn off. Customers were complaining about the lack of flavor and the high prices, and the staff was growing increasingly frustrated. The young line cook who had visited the food truck reached out to the chef again, this time with a plea. "We need you," he said. "The restaurant is falling apart, and the new chef doesn't care. He's too busy chasing fame to notice what's happening right in front of him." The chef listened quietly, his heart heavy. He still cared about the restaurant and the people who worked there, but he knew he couldn't go back. He had a new mission now, one that was bigger than just one kitchen. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I can't come back. But I'm working on something that might help all of us. Just hang in there a little longer." As the weeks went by, the chef's plan began to take shape. He found a small, cozy space in a bustling part of town and signed the lease. He hired a small team of dedicated cooks and servers, many of whom had worked with him in the past. And he finalized the menu, a mix of his classic dishes and new creations that reflected his journey. The day before the grand opening, the chef stood in the empty dining room, taking it all in. The walls were painted a warm, inviting color, the tables were set with simple but elegant place settings, and the kitchen was stocked with fresh ingredients. It wasn't the fanciest restaurant in town, but it was his, a place where he could cook from the heart and share his love of food with the world. As he locked up that night, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it. He had been knocked down, but he had gotten back up. And now, he was about to show everyone what he was truly made of. The morning of the grand opening arrived, and the chef woke up before the sun. He had barely slept, his mind racing with last-minute details and what-ifs. But as he stood in the kitchen of his new restaurant, the nerves began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. This was his moment, his chance to prove that he still had what it took to succeed. The staff arrived early, their energy infectious. They moved around the kitchen and dining room with purpose, polishing glasses, arranging flowers, and double-checking the menu. The chef's friend from the food truck was there too, helping wherever he could. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of excitement and anticipation. By the time the doors opened, a crowd had already gathered outside. Word had spread quickly about the chef's new venture, and people were eager to see what he had created. The first customers stepped inside, their eyes widening as they took in the warm, inviting space. The smell of fresh herbs, roasting meats, and baking bread filled the air, and the buzz of conversation grew louder with each passing minute. The chef stood in the kitchen, his hand steady as he plated the first dishes. He had chosen a menu that reflected his journey, classic dishes with a modern twist, each one infused with the passion and care that had defined his career. As the orders came in, he worked with precision, his movements fluid and confident. The kitchen staff followed his lead, their teamwork seamless. Out in the dining room, the reactions were everything the chef had hoped for. Customers raved about the food, their faces lighting up with each bite. "This is incredible," one woman said, her voice filled with wonder. "I haven't tasted anything like this in years." The chef's friend moved through the dining room, checking on tables and chatting with customers. He couldn't stop smiling. "This is it," he said to the chef during a brief lull in the kitchen. "You've done it. This place is going to be a hit." But the chef didn't have time to celebrate. The orders kept coming, and the kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. He was in his element, completely focused on the food and the experience he was creating for his customers. It was everything he had dreamed of and more. Meanwhile, across town, the old restaurant was eerily quiet. The new chef had heard about the grand opening and had tried to drum up business with a last-minute promotion, but it had backfired. The dining room was half empty, and the few customers who were there seemed unimpressed. The young line cook who had once idolized the old chef stood at his station, his frustration growing with each passing minute. "This isn't working," he muttered to himself. "We're losing them." Back at the new restaurant, the night was a resounding success. As the final customers left, their faces glowing with satisfaction, the chef finally allowed himself to breathe. He stepped out of the kitchen and into the dining room, where his staff was gathered, their faces beaming with pride. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "This is just the beginning, but tonight was perfect. Thank you, all of you, for believing in this dream." The staff cheered, their applause echoing through the room. The chef's friend clapped him on the back, his eyes shining with pride. "You've got something special here," he said. "Don't ever forget that." As the chef locked up that night, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. He had taken a risk, poured his heart into something new, and it had paid off. But he knew this was just the first step. The real work was just beginning. The success of the chef's new restaurant didn't go unnoticed. Within weeks, it became the talk of the town. Food critics raved about the menu, customers posted glowing reviews online, and reservations were booked solid for months. The chef had done the impossible. He had not only made a comeback, but had created something truly special. But with success came challenges. The old restaurant, now struggling more than ever, was desperate to stay afloat. The owner, realizing his mistake, decided to take drastic measures. He reached out to the chef with an offer he hoped would be impossible to refuse. One evening, as the chef was closing up his restaurant, the owner appeared at the door. He looked tired, his once sharp suit now rumpled and his confidence visibly shaken. The chef hesitated, then gestured for him to come in. "I'll get straight to the point," the owner said, his voice strained. "I want you to come back. I'll give you full control of the kitchen, a share of the profits, whatever you want. Just help me save the restaurant." The chef crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You fired me," he said simply. "You threw me out like I was nothing. And now you want me to come back?" The owner sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I messed up. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. But the restaurant, it's my life. I can't let it go under. And you're the only one who can fix this." The chef was silent for a long time, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to say no, to walk away and never look back. But another part of him remembered the years he had spent at that restaurant, the memories he had made, and the people who still worked there. He thought about the young line cook who had reached out to him, the staff who had supported him, and the customers who had loved his food. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But I'm not making any promises." The owner nodded, looking relieved. "Thank you. That's all I can ask for." As the owner left, the chef sat down at one of the tables, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He didn't want to go back to the old restaurant, but he also didn't want to see it fail. He knew he had a decision to make, and it wasn't going to be an easy one. The next day, the young line cook from the old restaurant showed up at the chef's new place. He looked nervous but determined. "I heard the owner came to see you," he said. "I just wanted to say, whatever you decide, I'll support you. But the staff, we're struggling. The new chef, he's tearing the place apart. We need someone like you to bring it back to life." The chef listened quietly, his heart heavy. He knew the young cook was right, the old restaurant needed help. But he also knew that going back would mean sacrificing the freedom and creativity he had found in his new venture. That evening, as he prepped for dinner service, the chef made a decision. He wasn't going to go back to the old restaurant, but he wasn't going to abandon it either. He had an idea, one that might just work for everyone. He called the owner and arranged a meeting. When they sat down, the chef laid out his plan. "I'm not coming back," he said firmly. "But I'm willing to help. I'll consult on the menu, train the staff, and help you rebrand. But it has to be on my terms. No more flashy gimmicks, no more chasing trends. We do it my way, with heart, with tradition, and with respect for the food." The owner hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Your way." The chef also reached out to the new chef, the one who had replaced him. To everyone's surprise, the young chef agreed to meet. The two men sat down in the chef's new restaurant, the tension between them palpable. "I've heard a lot about you," the young chef said, his tone cautious. "I know you think I'm just some arrogant kid, but I'm not. I just wanted to make a name for myself." The chef studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I get that. But cooking isn't about making a name for yourself. It's about the food, the people, the experience. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach you." The young chef looked surprised, then grateful. "I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, the chef divided his time between his new restaurant and the old one. He worked with the staff, revamped the menu, and helped the young chef find his footing. Slowly but surely, the old restaurant began to turn around. Customers returned, the atmosphere improved, and the kitchen became a place of collaboration rather than conflict. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of challenges along the way. But the chef knew he had made the right decision. He had found a way to honor his past while staying true to his present. And in doing so, he had created something even greater, a legacy that would last long after he was gone. Months passed, and the chef's life settled into a new rhythm. His restaurant continued to thrive, becoming a beloved fixture in the community. The old restaurant, now under his guidance, had also found its footing. The young chef he had mentored had grown into his role, blending his modern techniques with the traditional values the chef had instilled in him. The two kitchens, once rivals, now felt like two sides of the same coin, each unique, but united by a shared love of food. The chef's days were busy, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. He spent his mornings at his own restaurant, experimenting with new dishes and perfecting old ones. In the afternoons, he would visit the old restaurant, checking in with the staff and offering advice. It was a balancing act, but one he had come to cherish. One evening, as he was closing up his restaurant, the young line cook from the old restaurant stopped by. He looked different now, more confident, more at ease. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to help us, but you did. And it's made all the difference." The chef smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "You're welcome. I'm proud of how far you've come." The young cook hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking, maybe someday, I'll open my own place too. And if I do, I want it to be like this, a place where people feel at home." The chef nodded, his heart swelling with pride. That's what it's all about. Food isn't just about feeding people, it's about bringing them together. If you remember that, you'll do just fine. As the young cook left, the chef stood in the quiet dining room, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had been knocked down, but he had gotten back up. He had faced rejection, doubt, and betrayal, but he had never given up. And in the end, he had not only rebuilt his career, but had also helped others find their way. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He had learned that success wasn't about fame or money, it was about passion, perseverance, and the connections we make along the way. He had found a new purpose, not just in cooking, but in mentoring others and sharing his love of food with the world. As he locked up the restaurant that night, he felt a deep sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for it. He had faced his challenges head-on and had come out stronger on the other side. And he knew that no matter what happened next, he would always have his love of cooking to guide him. The chef walked down the quiet street, the lights of his restaurant glowing behind him. He had started with nothing but a dream, and now he had built something truly special. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a legacy, a testament to the power of resilience and the joy of following your passion. And as he disappeared into the night, one thing was certain, his story was far from over.